Thank you guys very much. I'm very excited to be here this morning. I was a little worried when I was asked to talk about being a pioneer, only because it just didn't strike me that I had any real authority to talk about that. But then I remembered that I know a lot about the game Oregon Trail, and so I went ahead and prepared for you guys a 20-minute dissertation on the way to win. The key really is that you don't want to die of dysentery, and that's important, guys. I can't stress that enough. And never be the banker from Missouri, because he always loses. So, oh, and you can only carry like 5 pounds of buffalo meat, even if you kill like a 3,000-pound buffalo. So remember that. You're going to have to kill another one, and then when you cross the river, shit's going to get pretty scary. So. No, I'm just going to stand up here and talk about that game. So after having a chance to talk to Blake and the guys over at Matchstick about this morning and having watched other folks speak, I started to try to think about, like, what is a pioneer, and what does it mean to try to be a pioneer? Like, what is the catalyst for wanting to be a pioneer? And I thought that maybe the best way to get around to that subject matter was to just sort of discuss something that took place in my professional life that you alluded to a little bit, and that was the building of Gun Show. So if we go back in time a little bit, back to those Top Chef days, as you said, like, Top Chef was not something I ever intended to do. In fact, without using quite as much profanity as I did on the telephone, when they called me to ask me to do it, I thought it was just a friend of mine playing a trick on me. And so I didn't have very nice things to say to them the 3 times that they called me. I'm really an idiot. I was like, dude, just middle of service, jerk. And then on the 4th call, they were like, Kevin, I promise you this is actually, I'm like, oh, sorry about that thing I called you the other day. I think your mom's really nice. I don't know why I said that. And so they started to describe the show to me, and I just didn't sound like something I wanted to do, because I was really terrified of the idea of doing a television show and then no longer being taken seriously as a chef. I was really worried that somehow inside my field, people would stop caring about what I was really trying to do, what I was pouring my heart and soul into, and then just say, yeah, but, you know, he's just that guy who does TV, and that's all he is. And so it terrified me to the point where I just absolutely said, no, I will not do it. And then one night at Woodfire, we did 0 people for dinner. And it was beyond heartbreaking, because, I mean, we were broke. We were winning awards left and right, and we were getting written up in magazines, and yet the restaurant was empty. And we had all borrowed all the money we could from our friends and family, and we had all maxed out our credit cards. And I knew, as well as my 2 business partners, that we really maybe had 6 months left that we could live, and then it was all going down in a flame of glory. And pride, frankly, at 25 years old when I did this, wouldn't let that happen. It was very ego-driven, and I said, I'm not going to have my first thing fail, and so I'll just figure out something to do. And all of a sudden that light bulb went off in my head that I should just call these people back and take them up on their offer. And so I called and said, send me a plane ticket. And they're like, well, it leaves tomorrow. I'm like, that's fine. They're like, so you're going to go to, and I'm like, I don't care where I'm going. Just send me that fucking ticket. Like, let's do this thing. So I packed my bag and I went off and I filmed this television show, and it turned out that it worked out very well for me. But what ended up happening from doing this show, and this is the part that no one, I think, ever could have expected, is that it changed me, is that it opened up some door inside me and let out a lot of stuff that was already there. And it was this need to try to be a very real version of myself through the only method that I had, which was through my food. And so I go back to Woodfire, and for several years, what I found was that I was slowly drifting away from the emulation of what my mentors had taught me into something that was very different. And I didn't really have a name for it, and I didn't really have a way to describe it. And so when every magazine called and said, like, what, tell me about your food, what, and I would always stumble and be like, we make it out of food and stuff, and and never have any ability to actually sort of give them what they were looking for. But it's because I myself didn't know what it was. It was just happening. It was just sort of happening. And one day, in the process of that just happening, something occurred to me that might seem crazy that I would have missed this point, but I realized that in the, 4 years that this place had been so bustly and so busy and we'd served so many people, that there were 2 people that I had never seen in my restaurant, and that was my mother and father. And I thought that was very peculiar. And so I called my mom and asked her about it, and I was like, you don't have to pay for dinner, right? Like, you guys can just come, it's free. And because I was like, it's surely like my parents who like refuse to spend any money on going out to dinner, that must be what it is. And she was like, no, we know that. But it's not that. It's that your father, he's afraid that he's going to embarrass you. And I was like, I don't understand. And so my mom sort of started to describe this to me. I grew up in a very, very, very financially unstable family. Neither of my parents graduated high school. They did the best that they could. My dad worked 3 jobs to try to keep us fed and keep the lights on. And he did all of this, and my mother worked just as hard in an attempt to make sure that my sister and I didn't have to live that same kind of life. They did everything they could to try to show us that there was something further away. But we were going to have to go get it, but there was something bigger and there was something better. And my father was worried that by coming into this place, he felt like I had graduated to like a new layer of society, I suppose, or just a different group of people who wouldn't want someone like him, so blue collar and uncouth and unfinished around the edges, to be in their space. He was proud of me for getting there, and so proud, in fact, that he didn't want to ruin it for me by perhaps maybe giving away my secret, that these people who I served every day weren't really that much like me at all. And it devastated me to hear that, because I remembered something that my dad said to me right after I graduated high school. When I was telling my parents that I just wasn't sure whether this college avenue that I was on was the right one, even though it was a very, very good school, it just didn't feel right to me, and that I thought maybe I would want to be a cook for a living, knowing good and well that this was going to literally break their hearts, because he'd done everything in his power to ensure that I didn't have to do a blue-collar job, that I didn't have to scrape by. And nevertheless, I just knew that inside me, I had something else that I had to do. I had to build something, but I had to do it with bricks and mortar the old-fashioned way, similar to what he had done. And my dad is a man of very, very few words, but what he said to me was that in this process, I was going to have to remember 3 things. And he said, the first is that you're going to have to work harder than everybody else. Like, you don't have a leg up. In fact, you took the one little leg up that you had and you kicked it aside. And so you're just going to have to work a lot harder, way harder. He said you're going to have to make a lot more sacrifices than other people will, because you're choosing to do something that the only way that you're going to be successful at it is if you put it first, above everything. And that includes us. Like us, your family. And then the last thing he said was just to never forget where you came from. And the first 2 of those lessons, they became very obvious to me pretty quickly. You do have to work harder than everyone else. Being in the restaurant world is not a very forgiving business, and really the only way to be successful at it, and I suppose this is probably true of just about any business in the world, is that if you really want to rise to the top, you have to be willing to give a much more concerted effort than most people do. And unfortunately, in the restaurant business, an average amount of effort is still a 12-hour day. So that means the 14 and 16 and 18-hour days. And for many, many years when I was running Woodfire, it was closer to 20-hour days. And the sacrifice thing became very obvious to me. Every relationship I ever had fell apart. No one I was with could ever understand the vision of where it was that I was trying to go. Because though I wasn't physically leaving and going somewhere else, I kept seeing this place that I was traveling to. I kept seeing this idea that if I mowed ahead on this path that was poorly marked at best, that somehow or another I would end up in a place that I knew I could get to. And so, unfortunately, what goes along with that is the sacrifice of those who aren't either strong enough to go or who just don't want to go. And so, those two things became very brutally honest and very real for me in a very, very quick, short amount of time. But then the last one was the one that just didn't make sense until that day when I had to listen to my mom tell me that my dad was worried about it embarrassing me. And I realized that I had very much forgotten where I came from. And so that was the catalyst for literally, I didn't sell Woodfire. I signed over my ownership for free to my business partners that day because I felt like I just couldn't do that anymore, that was just not the path that I was meant to be on. And all the while, I felt like I had been traversing this, figurative as it were, Oregon Trail, trying to get to this place that I knew, this land of sunshine and beauty that I could see in my head, but I really couldn't express it to anyone else. And so I knew that the only thing I could do at that point was to leave Woodfire and to build something different. And I had to build something that was very me. I had to build the thing that accomplished what I was looking for. And so Gun Show came about in this attempt to continue down the trail, because what had happened is I had literally reached that river crossing, and there was no way to cross it. I realized that I was stuck on this side until I took that next risk, and I left and went and did my own thing. Now, the downside to that is that I thought my idea was brilliant, and no one else did. So all these super rich people who had always told me, like, if you need money for a restaurant, I got you. And then I went, hey, I need money for a restaurant. And they went, what? What are you talking about? I would never give you money for a restaurant. Yes, literally, 100% of them across the board went, Kevin, I think you're brilliant, but you've lost your fucking mind. Like, that was pretty much the unanimous opinion across the board was, so let me work through this. You want to build a restaurant that's purposely too small? Yes. You want to build a restaurant that doesn't have a menu that people can in any way read or interact with? Yeah, that's right. You don't want them to be able to order the food that you are making? Yeah. That's how we're going to do it. You want to play death metal at the loudest volume possible that the radio will work at, and cut the lights to the point where you can basically see through people's skin. That's pretty much it. And you're going to call it Gun Show. It's a great name, right? No. So what ended up happening is that I had to self-fund Gun Show. So that meant my wife and I coming up with some very creative accounting in order to start construction and then just keep making it happen. But eventually we did get the restaurant open, and in the process of getting this restaurant open, what we learned was that there's a lot to be said for what it takes to go off and do something that isn't seen. And I think that's what the spirit of the pioneer is, and of pioneering. It's not about not being afraid. Courage is something that I think everyone realizes must go along with being a pioneer. But what people mistake is that they think that courage implies this fearlessness, and it's exactly the opposite. Courage is that point in your life when you're genuinely terrified of your own failure, of ruining everyone else's life around you, and yet you push through it. You find a way to dig yourself out of that fear. Embrace the fact that it's there. Live it. Use it. Turn it into fuel and make something of it. That is what courage is. And courage is one of the cornerstones of being a pioneer. I think the other pieces to being a pioneer come back to the things that my dad said to me. There's this hard work component to it. The folks who we think of as pioneers, the people who got in a wagon and rode from here to San Francisco, which I complain about how long that takes in a plane. So, yeah, I'm that guy who's like, 5 hours? What? P.S., it takes like a long-ass time if you're in a wagon. So, those people actually understood what hard work meant. Packing a wagon, getting an ox. Where do you even get one of those at? And working through the difficulties that came day in and day out. And my difficulties were tiny in comparison to that. But opening a restaurant that didn't have any money at all. Like, we bought groceries with the last money we had and opened going, if people don't show up and buy all this perishable food, we're up shit creek. So thank God they did. Dealing with the fact that now all of a sudden you've taken on this responsibility. You've employed people. You've given people jobs. It's a very, I think building jobs, giving people jobs is a very noble thing. The flip side of that exact same coin is that once you do that, you will never be able to let go of this idea that it is your responsibility to them to ensure that their family is fed and that their clothes are on their back and that the lights are kept on in their home. And so all of a sudden, you're back in the shoes of my father, of someone who did whatever he had to do to make sure that it could be better for people. And it's a scary place. And you know that the only way to do it is to work harder. The sacrifice part is one that becomes very real for you when you're trying to find your own way, when you're trying to find your own path. Sometimes it means personal relationships are damaged. Sometimes it means that you go without. Like, I can literally tell you how many. Most people don't realize that the reason I didn't have a television in my home when I first did this wasn't because I was trying to be some cool, like, new school kid who doesn't watch TV. It's because I couldn't afford a television or cable, because I had to take the money that would have been used for that and use it to keep the phone on at the restaurant so people could call and make a reservation. We didn't have open table for you to make an online reservation because we couldn't afford the $1 per person that it costs. Couldn't afford it. And so you make sacrifices all the while knowing that this place that you're headed for is a very real thing. Because you have this last little piece that maybe my dad didn't make reference to, but that I have learned so quickly is the cornerstone of being a pioneer, and it's faith. Not in that spiritual, religious way. There's nothing wrong with faith in that form, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the faith that you must have, that I think everybody in here has. I think every creative person has it. But faith is like a door that's somewhere deep down inside you that you have to open. And what's inside that, behind that door, is this knowledge all along of the fact that even though it can't be seen, this place that you're looking for and this thing you're trying to make, even though it's not tangible yet, and that other people around you perhaps can't see it, it's the faith of the fact that over that next hill and that horizon, that thing that you made all those sacrifices for, that place that you worked so hard to get to, that idea that gave you the courage to cross that river, to do whatever you had to do in your life to get there, well, that it's been there all along, actually. It's the faith that inside you is that place that you want to be. And so if you're going to build it, and if you're going to be a pioneer, and I challenge every one of you to ask yourself, what does it mean for you to be a pioneer? What you have to first do is let your hands down and give up to that faith that you'll get there. You'll get there one day. You just got to keep working for it. Thanks, guys.
Awesome. Kevin, that was incredible. Thank you. All right, we're going to do a Q&A. So I'll run a mic over here, and then I believe Tom's going to run one over there. So raise your hand if you have a question, and Kevin will call on you. These boots are slippery.
Thanks for the talk. I'm going to ask a question that's maybe a little less about pioneering and maybe a little bit more personal. Has your father had a chance to experience gun show? And if yes, what did he think about it and what did it mean to you?
We didn't think that part through, did we? Yeah. Here you go.
We just got the one mic. The Fox has one mic. It's a little known fact about the Fox Theater. One mic. My dad has had a chance to come to gun show. Part of that, like, making gun show happen things meant tapping into all of the men in my family who are all tradesmen and do something with their hands and make something. So my dad very much had a hand in the building of gun show. He has dined there a few times. He thinks it's obnoxiously loud and bright, as 97% of everybody does. My dad actually prefers my other restaurant, Revival, over gun show, but I think that's because Revival's entire repertoire is his mother's, like, handwritten cookbook. So I think he likes that one a little bit better.
How about right here?
Can you tell us about your latest venue at the stadium?
Yeah,
Stadium?
absolutely. So for those of you who haven't gone to a football game or a soccer game or perhaps a Garth Brooks concert, I have a new restaurant called Game Changer, which is a total asshole name, in the Mercedes-Benz Stadium. I thought it was very clever. Maybe it's not. So Game Changer is it's fancy junk food. Like, when I go to a football game, I'm not like, it'd be good, a croquembouche. Instead, I'm like, yeah, I want something that's preferably deep fried, and if you can cover it in cheese, that'd be awesome too. But the problem has always been that even though it was ludicrously expensive, the food was terrible at games. At every sporting event, it's made out of stuff that really should concern you that you're eating it. And I'm not real preachy about that because I'm fine with everything people eat, but I'm convinced that they just take the old ticket stubs and run them through a wood chipper. And that's how most of the things previously in the stadium were made. And so I felt like we could definitely cook delicious but indulgent food that still matched our parameters that we use in our own restaurants. And so Game Changer is a very simple menu. It's cheesesteaks and fried chicken sandwiches and fries and adult slush puppies and things like that. And so it's a lot of fun. We have a really great selection of local beers as well. And it is, as insane as this sounds, it is the entire western end zone of the Mercedes-Benz Stadium. It's very dainty and intimate. It only does about 6,000 people a day. So be one of those. Come see me sometime. I'll be there. Just dial hell, I'll be the guy who picks up.
Hi. What is the inspiration behind Gun Show and all those crazy pioneering ideas that you talk about?
Yeah, Gun Show came about in a kind of a funny but rudimentary way, which is like a classic pros and cons list. I was taking what we were doing at Woodfire and asking myself, what do we do really well and what do we do really poorly? And so I just kind of drew them out, and my original goal was, let's just not do the things we do badly and do only the things we do well. And so I tried to design that. Turns out you can't really do things that way. It's sort of like a seesaw. And when we took all the shit off one side, it fell down on the other side. So instead, we started over from scratch and asked ourselves, what is it that we wanted to do in the first place? And so we kind of came to some cornerstones. One was that we wanted the cooks to have direct interaction with the guests, because I just thought it was weird that for years our method was that this guy up at the top would come up with an idea, and then he would explain that to people below him, who would then make something and try their best to explain it to a third person, who would inevitably go tell a stranger what this other guy had thought he was originally going to plan on making but had someone else do. That seemed like a weird system to me, perhaps maybe not the most fluid. And so we wanted whoever conceptualized the idea to cook their own food and then serve their own food and tell you about it, because I thought it would be very real. I thought for the first time, even if you were scared to eat something, perhaps you would suspend disbelief long enough to try something that was a little bit different because you were talking to that person, because you could see in their eyes that they believed in this thing that they were making. And maybe if they would take that risk to come out and try to socialize, which most cooks are not super great at, they're all fucking weirdos, that you could take a risk as well and try something. And more than anything, maybe you get to take the journey together. And so making that the cornerstone of the way that we developed the food, and then building a space around that was incredibly transparent, perhaps too much so, because I wanted the charade to go away. People for years said the theater of food, and I said, well, I think the beauty is in all the stuff that happens backstage too. It's not just about the actors. They should be able to see the rigging. They should be able to see the lighting. They should be able to see all of this for what it is. And then all of a sudden, when they leave, they'll recognize that they themselves were part of the cast that evening also. And so that's why we built Gun Show that way.
Question over here.
Hey, I'm Megan.
Hi.
So a lot of us in here are in the marketing and branding industry. And when you first spoke, you talked about owning one restaurant, and now today you're a brand. So what was it practically? Did you have like a certain person that helped you develop your vision, or like how did you become the brand that you are today? And just going from even a chef to being a great speaker now.
Thank you. Well, step one was I grew this awesome beard. So, the hard work was done. It's still weird for me to acknowledge our brand and me as a brand. It feels very peculiar to me, but I'll try my best to answer your question. So I have always been drawn to imagery and to the stamps, the chosen visuals that a business or a person decides for themselves embody the spirit of whatever they're working on. I was the kid who always wanted to buy, even when music became available digitally, I would still go out and buy the record because I wanted to see what the band chose as the background for their liner notes. Like, what was their cover art? Why is their logo written this way in particular? And so that visual was always very, very important to me. And I realized over time that the choice of that way you present yourself forward was very important. Like, it started to be something that people could connect to. And so as time went on and we had just one restaurant and we're beginning to think about growing and being something bigger, and that growth, by the way, was driven by one reason alone. It was by the fact that we had talented people, and those talented people needed to graduate to another level of their career that I couldn't provide them. So rather than them leaving, I just said, let's go build that thing, and then you can do that. And so we built it as they needed to grow. And so when I realized that meant that Kevin wasn't going to be the guy who literally shook the pans and washed the dishes and wrote the checks and was going to have to be much more of this mentor, leader, coach role, I realized that we had to build something that would eventually one day transcend me. That if the strength of our company was on one guy, the second this guy was out sick, it all collapsed around you, and that was just not a very smart way of doing things. And so that's when this conversation about building our brand came along. And I did have a very good friend who helped us roadmap our plan. And then I had some wonderful people around me. In fact, I have one here in the front row, Maggie, who works for us in our corporate office. I surrounded myself with a lot of creative people who had a vision as well, and asked them to contribute. So rather than it being the one man, one voice that maybe perhaps it was in the very early days, it became this communal effort to develop something, and the cohesive factor was that we all believed in the same vision. And so out of that came Redbeard Restaurants, and we sort of found ourselves resting on these mutual ideas that we could build something that was simultaneously great, but it wasn't exclusatory. That we could build something that had a certain standard of the way that it approached its work, but didn't take itself too seriously. And so out of that has grown in a very organic manner, and sometimes organic growth means oh, dear God, what did we do? Out of that has grown what we now have today.
All right, last question. Joe.
Thanks. It's actually two.
It's a two-parter.
Two-parter. Well, two different questions. One is, what's the one thing you wish you knew when you started at Woodfire or at Gun Show, whichever you prefer? And then the second is, what other Atlanta chefs or restaurants do you really respect or are you watching right now?
So one thing I wish I had known. Let's think of the appropriate professional answer to this. The thing that perhaps I wish I had realized in the very early days of my career was that humility was probably the most important virtue you could carry. Everything I had read up to that date from every professional chef everywhere talked about how the only reason you would ever go out and build your own restaurant is if your ego drove it, like because you think you're better and you need that. That's the energy for it. That was very much the old school opinion of being a chef, was that you're better than everybody else, that's why you do it. I would argue that it's the exact opposite, that I work in the service of others, and I should be humbled at the fact that they wish in any way whatsoever to join me and give me the money that they've worked very hard for in exchange for this thing that I'm trying to build for them. The sooner you realize that in the restaurant world, I think probably the sooner that you'll be happy and successful. The second one regarding people that I respect, you guys probably all realize this, but Atlanta's a really phenomenal restaurant city, honest to God. Yeah. You know, I have the luxury of traveling all over the world at this point and getting to dine everywhere. And there was a time when I couldn't say that, and those days are long since past. I come home to Atlanta and am constantly impressed by what we have available to us, and I think there's a lot of super talented people here. Just, to rattle off just a few, I look towards people like Linton Hopkins for having built restaurants of a very high standard and maintaining those. I think Ford Fry has done a phenomenal job of understanding a brand and growing a brand. It's something that I marvel at every day, that what they've been able to do. It just literally blows my mind. And then there are chefs who I just think their raw talent is so unbelievable that it's a little intimidating, to be very honest with you. I think Bruce Logue over at Boca Lupo has a touch with pasta that I have never in my career ever been able to master. The best thing I've ever made in the world of pasta has probably been equivalent to one of the worst things he's ever made. And so dining in a place like that is literally the reason you won't ever see me making pasta, because I know that it'll, at best, be the second best pasta being made in Atlanta on any given day. And what I love about Atlanta is that you can also find inspiration from people who are cooking in hole-in-the-wall places on Buford Highway, who can barely speak a lick of English, who don't have any concern with being the next famous chef. They're still doing it for the raw, real passion of believing in and loving the power of food. It's why I chose to be in this business. Food, guys, is this grand leveler. And I'll leave you with just this one idea. I was saying this to someone earlier this morning, that food is this thing that is part of human beings. We're part and parcel to this idea of cooking. We're the only animal species in the world that chooses to alter its food before we consume it. And so inside every one of us is a bond to the art and the craft and the passion for preparing food and sharing it with others. And so to be a part of that field every day, in the good days and in the bad days, I still know that inevitably there's some beautiful humanistic quality to the work that I do. And so I love watching it in its most simple and raw form, and that means watching people make it for their friends and for their family. And I still love that idea of being able to share a little piece of yourself, like tell a little bit of your own personal story through something that people can eat, and then that vanishes, it disappears, and it goes away, and so you're forced every day to come back face to face with that goal. So thank you guys, really, very, very much.